Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about how we can work together to try to persuade the IESO to develop a least cost plan to move Ontario to a zero carbon electricity grid and lower electricity bills. Before we discuss how we can phase out the gas-fired power plants, it's important to highlight two of the key features of Doug Ford's electricity plan. The first key feature, as everyone knows, is that he's planning to ramp up the gas plant's greenhouse gas pollution by more than 600% by 2040. But another key feature of the plan is he's planning to spend $28 billion on high-cost nuclear projects, which will push up our electricity rates and bills. And this slide shows Ontario's historic and forecast greenhouse gas pollution from the power plants. It goes from 2005 to 2040. And as you know, thanks to the coal phase-out, we reduced the greenhouse gas pollution from our power plants by 93% between 2005 and 2017. But after 2017, the pollution from the power plant started to rise again. The IESO is now forecasting that it'll rise by more than 600% by 2040. And if that occurs, we'll lose approximately half of the pollution reduction benefits that we gained by phasing out dirty coal. And here's a breakout of Doug Ford's proposed $28 billion spending on nuclear, $12.8 billion to rebuild Darlington's 4 aging reactors, $13 billion to rebuild 6 of the Bruce nuclear station's aging nuclear reactors, and then $3 billion to build a new GTA nuclear reactor. These are the highest cost options to keep our lights on. They'll push our electricity rates and bills up. Now, as you know, Ontario's municipalities believe that Doug Ford is going in the wrong direction. 32 municipalities, representing almost 60% of our population, have passed resolutions calling for the phase out of gas power. They've called for the return of the gas plants' pollution back to their 2017 level as soon as possible, and to achieve a complete phase out of gas power by 2030. Now, the IESO, as you know, in October, issued a report in response to the municipalities' requests. And the IESO's report said it would be impossible to phase out gas power by 2030. And they said if we attempted to do so, our electricity rates will go through the roof and we would experience blackouts. Now, the good news is that all of these claims by the IESO are absolutely false. Now, first, with respect to the claim that it's impossible to phase out the gas plants, well, when you read the fine print of their report, they actually developed a strategy to move Ontario to a 99.7% zero carbon electricity grid by 2030. But then they made this absolutely absurd claim that it would be absolutely impossible to meet the remaining 0.3% of our electricity needs from carbon-free sources by 2030. And that claim is obviously wrong, because we all know that if we invest a bit more money in energy efficiency and renewables, we obviously can increase our electricity supply by another small 0.3% by 2030. Now, this slide shows that we can actually phase out our gas-fired power plants by 2030 and also lower our electricity bills, which is totally contrary to the IESO's messaging. So what we have here are bar graphs of our various electricity options. The lowest cost options are on the left-hand side. Now, I want to draw your attention first to the bar graph in the middle with a cost of 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That is the fuel and carbon tax cost of continuing to operate our gas plants in 2030 if they're subject to a carbon tax of $170 per ton. Now, if you look at the bar graphs on the left-hand side of the 9 cent per kilowatt hour bar graph, and what you will see is that energy efficiency, Quebec water power, wind and solar can all keep our lights on at a much lower cost than continuing to operate the gas-fired power plants in 2030. So what that tells us is clear. If we invest in energy efficiency and renewables, we can phase out the gas-fired power plants by 2030 and lower our electricity costs and lower our electricity bills. I also want to draw your attention to the three bar graphs on the right-hand side, starting with the bar graph, which is a cost of 10.5 cents a kilowatt hour. That is the price we're paying to OPG today for their nuclear electricity. Now look at the bar graph with a cost of 13.7 cents a kilowatt hour. That's the price we'll be paying to OPG in 2027 for nuclear electricity if they're allowed to complete the rebuilding of all four of Darlington's nuclear reactors. Finally, look at the bar graph with 16.3 cents as its cost. That's the cost of a new GTA nuclear reactor, according to the nuclear industry. Now, again, if you look to the left-hand side, energy efficiency and renewables can keep our lights on at a much lower cost. So what this tells us is that we can also lower our electricity bills by investing in energy efficiency and renewables to reduce our dependence on high-cost nuclear power. So this is the good news. Energy efficiency and renewables are now not only the environmentally preferred option, but also they're the financially preferred option if your goal is to reduce electricity bills and electricity costs. Of course, Doug Ford and the ISO claim that that's their goal, but they're actually promoting the highest cost options and the most polluting options to keep our lights on. And while that serves the interest of OPG and Bruce Power and gas-fired power companies, it's not in the best interest of the consumers or the planet. So clearly the IESO needs to go back to the drawing board and develop an unbiased, fact-based least cost plan to return our gas plants' pollution back to the 2017 level as soon as possible and achieve a complete gas power phase-out by 2030. Now, here's our three-point plan to return the gas plants' pollution to their 2017 level. First, ban gas-fired electricity exports to the US. That could instantaneously give us a big reduction in gas-fired pollution. Second, purchase all the energy efficiency savings in wind and solar power that can keep our lights on at less than today's price of nuclear electricity. And third, triple our purchases of Quebec water power using our existing transmission lines. If we did these three things, we could quickly return our gas plants' pollution back to their 2017 level. But as you all know, the demand for gas-fired electricity is at its greatest during our hottest summer days and our coldest winter nights. So in order to achieve a 100% phase out of gas power by 2030, we also need to expand our transmission links with Quebec so we can import more water power from Quebec on those hot summer days. And we need to install bidirectional chargers so our electric vehicles' batteries can provide power back to the grid on peak demand days. And this is such an important measure because in 2030, the capacity of our electric vehicles' batteries will be more than double the capacity of our gas-fired power plants. Okay, and finally, as you recall, the ISO report says if we attempt to phase out the gas plants by 2030, that will lead to blackouts. Well, that claim by the ISO was absolutely irresponsible scaremongering. But, scaremongering can be a very powerful political tool that could be used, again, by the ISO and Doug Ford to attack Andrea Horwath or Mike Schreiner during the election when they call for a gas power phase out by 2030. So we have to take this scaremongering club away from the ISO and Doug Ford. And the good news is there's a very simple way to do that. Just demand that OPG put its 5 gas-fired power plants on standby reserve between 2030 and 2040 to provide emergency backup power to the grid if, for any reason, we temporarily don't have sufficient zero-carbon resources to keep our lights on. So if we do that, we put the OPG's gas plants on standby reserve, we can promise the people of Ontario, and Andrea Horwath and Mike Schreiner can promise the people of Ontario that they will phase out gas power by 2030 with absolutely no risk of blackouts. And so here's what we're proposing to do between now and the provincial election. First, communicate to the public, the media, and politicians that we can phase out gas power by 2030 and lower our electricity bills. Second, we want to persuade Stephen Del Duca and Doug Ford to call for a gas power phase out by 2030. And third, we want to participate in the IESO's consultation process to try to persuade them to develop a least cost plan to phase out our gas-fired power in Ontario. So thank you for your attention, and Angela, it's now back to you.